I never thought a livestock water heater would be the thing that destroyed my peaceful existence in Montana. But here we are, sitting in a courtroom while my HOA president glares at me like I personally orchestrated the apocalypse. My name is Henry Garrison, and I run a small hobby farm just outside Billings, Montana. Nothing fancy, just 20 acres with a dozen chickens, 4 goats, 2 sheep, and a miniature horse named Butterscotch that my daughter absolutely insisted we needed. I work as a civil engineer during the day, which means I understand water flow, drainage systems, and the consequences of freezing temperatures better than most people. That knowledge would become both my greatest asset and the thing that made this entire disaster so frustratingly predictable. When my wife Sarah and I moved to Meadowbrook Estates 3 years ago, we were thrilled to find a community that allowed agricultural use on properties over 10 acres. The HOA bylaws explicitly permitted livestock, gardens, and farm equipment. We read every single page of that covenant document before signing. I even highlighted the relevant sections and kept them in a binder, because I am that kind of person. My daughter Emma was 8 then, and she had been begging for animals since she could talk. This seemed like the perfect compromise between suburban convenience and rural living. The first 2 winters went smoothly. I installed heated livestock tanks in the fall, which kept the water from freezing solid when temperatures dropped below zero. These tanks are standard equipment for anyone keeping animals in cold climates. They have a simple heating element that keeps the water just above freezing, maybe 40 degrees, so the animals can drink. The alternative is breaking ice multiple times a day or hauling heated water from the house, which is neither practical nor humane when you work full-time. Everything changed when Brenda Patterson became HOA president last spring. Brenda was a 52-year-old former real estate agent who had moved to Montana from California 5 years earlier. She had strong opinions about everything and the free time to enforce them. Within weeks of her election, she began sending violation notices to half the neighborhood. My first notice arrived in June, complaining that my chicken coop was visible from the street. Never mind that it was 200 feet from the road, painted barn red to match my house, and surrounded by landscaping. According to Brenda, it was an eyesore that diminished property values. I ignored that notice after confirming the coop met all setback requirements and the covenants had no restrictions on agricultural structures. The second notice came in July, this time about my manure pile. I had a small compost area behind my barn where I mixed animal waste with straw and wood shavings. It was properly maintained, turned regularly, and produced zero odor beyond 10 feet. Brenda claimed someone complained about the smell, though she refused to say who. I suspected she was the only complainant, since my nearest neighbor was my friend Rick, who kept bees and frequently asked for my composted manure for his garden. By August, Brenda had moved on to complaining about my truck being parked in the driveway instead of the garage, my garden fence being the wrong shade of brown, and my daughter riding her bike on the sidewalk after 7 p.m. That last one was not even an HOA rule, just something Brenda decided should be a rule. I started documenting everything, taking photos, keeping copies of all correspondence. My engineering background made me meticulous about records, and I had a feeling I would need them. The real trouble started in October. I received a certified letter informing me that the HOA board had voted to ban all electrical equipment related to livestock care, effective immediately. The letter cited concerns about energy consumption, fire hazards, and aesthetic issues. It specifically mentioned heated water tanks, heat lamps, and electric fencing. Failure to comply would result in fines of $100 per day. I read that letter 3 times, certain I was misunderstanding something. Banning heated livestock tanks in Montana was like banning snow shovels or winter coats. It made no sense from any practical, ethical, or legal standpoint. I called an emergency meeting with the board, which consisted of Brenda, her friend Margaret Chen, who always voted exactly how Brenda wanted, and Tom Bradley, a retired accountant who seemed perpetually confused about what was happening. The meeting took place in Brenda's living room, which was decorated entirely in shades of white and cream. She had plastic covers on her furniture and made me take off my boots at the door, even though I had wiped them thoroughly on the mat. I sat on her slippery couch with my documentation folder, prepared to explain why this new rule was problematic. This ban makes no sense. I started, keeping my voice level and professional. Heated livestock tanks are standard equipment. Without them, the animals cannot access water when temperatures drop below freezing. That is animal cruelty. Brenda sipped her tea and set it down with a precise click on her coaster. The covenants give us authority to regulate equipment that affects the community appearance and safety. These tanks are an electrical fire hazard. They are UL listed and designed specifically for outdoor use in extreme weather, I countered. I am a civil engineer. I checked the electrical load. They draw less power than a space heater and are safer than most Christmas lights. There has never been a single fire incident related to livestock tank heaters in this community or any neighboring community. Margaret nodded along with everything Brenda said, but remained silent. Tom looked at his notepad like it might contain answers to questions he had not thought to ask. The decision has been made, Brenda said with finality. You have until November 1st to remove the equipment. November 1st is 2 weeks away. Temperatures already drop below freezing at night. What am I supposed to do about water for the animals? That is not the HOA's concern. Perhaps you should reconsider whether livestock are appropriate for this community. The way she said it made everything clear. This was not about safety or electrical concerns. Brenda wanted me to get rid of my animals entirely, and she was using these manufactured rules to force my hand. I thought about my daughter Emma, now 11, who spent every morning before school feeding the chickens and talking to Butterscotch. I thought about the goats, Lucy and Ethel, who were probably the friendliest creatures on earth, and bleated excitedly whenever anyone walked near their enclosure. I will be consulting with an attorney, I said, standing up. This rule violates the agricultural use provisions in the original covenants. It also creates animal welfare issues that could expose the HOA to liability. Brenda's smile was tight and cold. You do what you feel necessary. The fine schedule begins November 2nd if the equipment is still installed. I left her house angry but convinced I could fight this through proper channels. I spent that weekend researching Montana HOA law, which is more favorable to homeowners than in many states. HOAs cannot enforce rules that contradict state law or the original covenants without a supermajority vote of all homeowners. Brenda had rammed this through with just the 3-person board, which seemed legally questionable. Monday morning, I contacted an attorney who specialized in HOA disputes. Her name was Patricia Holmes, and she had an office in downtown Billings. She listened to my situation and reviewed my documentation. You have a strong case, Patricia said, leaning back in her chair. The original covenants explicitly allow livestock and associated equipment. This new rule is arbitrary and capricious. However, litigation takes time. We are talking months, possibly over a year if they appeal. In the meantime, winter is coming. What is your practical plan for the animals? That was the question that kept me up at night. I could not let the water tanks freeze solid for months while we worked through the legal system. I could break ice multiple times a day, but my work schedule made that nearly impossible. I was often on job sites an hour away, and Sarah worked as a nurse with 12-hour shifts. Emma was in school and too young to manage it alone, especially in sub-zero temperatures before dawn. What if I just keep using the tanks, I asked. Pay the fines under protest while we fight this. Patricia shook her head. At $100 per day, you are looking at over $10,000 by spring. They can put a lien on your house. Plus, it establishes that you knowingly violated their rule, which complicates the case. I left her office with more questions than answers. November 1st arrived with the first real cold snap of the season. Temperatures dropping to 15 degrees overnight. I stood in my barn staring at those heated tanks, watching the steam rise from the 40-degree water, while my breath fogged in the cold air. The goats drank deeply, unaware that this simple comfort was about to become a battleground. I unplugged the heaters on November 2nd. The water froze solid within 12 hours. I went out at 5 a.m. before work and used a rubber mallet to break the ice, creating a hole big enough for the animals to drink. By the time I got home at 6 p.m., it had frozen again. I broke it again, then set my alarm for 10 p.m. to do it once more before bed. Sarah helped when she could, but her shifts were unpredictable. Emma tried to help before school, but I refused to let her swing a mallet in the dark and cold. She was upset, crying about how the animals must be so thirsty. Within 3 days, I was exhausted. Within a week, I was running on coffee and anger. The temperatures kept dropping, reaching single digits and then below zero. The livestock were stressed, drinking less, because they knew the water would be frozen most of the time. I started hauling heated water from the house in insulated buckets, which helped but was not sustainable long term. On November 15th, I received another certified letter from Brenda. Someone had apparently seen me using a temporary heat lamp in the goat shelter during a particularly brutal cold spell. That also violated the new equipment ban. The letter threatened additional fines and legal action if I did not comply immediately. I was furious enough to crumple that letter and throw it across my living room, something I had not done since I was a teenager. Sarah put her hand on my shoulder. We need to end this. Either fight it properly or find a new solution. What new solution? Let them freeze? Sell the animals? Maybe there is a compromise. What about propane heaters? Those are not electrical. It was a creative thought, but propane heaters designed for livestock use were expensive and still required electricity for the ignition systems on most models. I looked into them anyway, desperate for options. The non-electric models were essentially open flame heaters, which were genuinely dangerous around straw and hay. If Brenda thought electric heaters were a fire hazard, actual flames would give her ammunition I did not want to provide. Meanwhile, the first significant snow arrived. We got 8 inches overnight and the temperature stayed below zero for 5 straight days. I was breaking ice 4 times a day, my hands numb despite insulated gloves. The goats were miserable, huddling together for warmth. The chickens reduced their egg production to almost nothing, stressed by the cold and inconsistent water access. During one of my midnight ice-breaking sessions, I noticed something that would later become the most important detail of this entire disaster. Water from the broken ice was running across my property, following the natural slope of the land. My 20 acres sat at a higher elevation than most of the subdivision. The previous owner had graded the property to channel water away from the barn and animal areas, directing it toward the eastern property line where it could absorb into a natural drainage area. This system worked perfectly during rain and snowmelt, because the water could flow freely. But now, with me breaking ice multiple times daily, I was creating artificial runoff in freezing temperatures. The water would flow about 20 feet, then freeze. The next batch of water would flow over that ice, extending it further. By late November, I had created an ice sheet that stretched nearly 100 feet from my water tanks toward my property line. It was not particularly thick, maybe an inch or two, and I assumed it would melt when we hit a warm spell. What I did not realize was how much water I was introducing to the ground through this process. Each time I broke the ice and the animals drank, some water spilled. Each time I refilled the tanks, some splashed out. All that water had to go somewhere, and with the ground frozen solid, it could not soak in. It just kept flowing downhill, freezing in layers, creating a growing mass of ice that followed the natural drainage path. Rick mentioned it when he came over to borrow a tool. "You have got quite an ice rink forming over there," he said, pointing at the frozen expanse. "Yeah, side effect of breaking ice constantly. It will melt eventually, probably. Just watch out it does not cause problems with drainage come spring thaw." I should have paid more attention to that warning, but I was too exhausted and frustrated to think clearly about long-term consequences. My entire focus was getting through each day, keeping the animals watered and healthy, and working with Patricia on the legal challenge. By December, we had filed a formal complaint against the HOA, requesting an injunction against the equipment ban. The court date was set for January 15th, which seemed impossibly far away. Brenda responded by increasing her harassment. She drove by my property daily, taking photos of anything she deemed a violation. She sent letters about my firewood being stacked improperly, my barn door being the wrong color, and my truck being parked 6 inches too far to the left in my driveway. The Christmas season was miserable. Instead of enjoying the holidays with my family, I was outside in negative temperatures, breaking ice and hauling water. Emma made a drawing at school of our animals, which normally would have been cute, except she titled it "My Sad Farm," and drew the animals with frowning faces because they were cold. Her teacher called Sarah to ask if everything was okay at home. We had to explain the HOA situation, which was humiliating. The ice sheet on my property continued growing. What had been a minor frozen patch was now a substantial glacial formation covering several hundred square feet. It followed the natural drainage channel, extending all the way to my eastern fence line and beyond onto the undeveloped common area that separated my property from the main subdivision. That common area was about 2 acres of natural grassland that the HOA was supposed to maintain but largely ignored. Beyond it were the houses on Pinewood Drive, a row of upscale homes where several board members lived, including Brenda. January arrived with record-breaking cold. We had a week where the temperature never climbed above zero, reaching -20 on several nights. I had to check the animals every few hours, worried that even short gaps would leave them without water long enough to cause health issues. I was sleeping maybe 4 hours a night, and Sarah was covering extra shifts at the hospital because one of her colleagues had the flu. Emma spent most of her winter break at her grandmother's house because we were too exhausted to properly care for her. The court hearing on January 15th started well. Patricia presented our case methodically, showing how the equipment ban contradicted the original covenants and created animal welfare concerns. She had expert testimony from a veterinarian explaining why heated water was essential for livestock in Montana winters. She presented the electrical safety data showing these devices were no more dangerous than any other outdoor electrical equipment. The HOA's attorney, a slick guy named Robert Crane, argued that the board had broad authority to regulate equipment and that I could provide water through non-electrical means. The judge seemed skeptical of his arguments, but said he needed to review the full covenant documents before ruling. He promised a decision within 2 weeks. I left the courthouse feeling cautiously optimistic. That optimism lasted exactly 3 days until the weather finally broke. On January 18th, the temperature climbed to 45 degrees, nearly 60 degrees warmer than the previous week. The sun came out. The massive amount of snow and ice that had accumulated started melting, including the enormous ice sheet on my property. I was at work when it happened, managing a drainage project for a new commercial development. The irony was not lost on me later. I got the first phone call at 2 p.m. from a number I did not recognize. Then another call. Then Sarah called, saying neighbors were trying to reach me. I excused myself from the meeting and listened to my voicemail. The first message was from Margaret Chen, surprisingly. "Henry, this is Margaret from the HOA board. We have a situation. Please call me back immediately." The second was from someone I did not know. "This is Davis Murphy on Pinewood Drive. Your property is flooding the neighborhood. You need to get home now." My stomach dropped. I called Sarah while jogging to my truck. "What is happening? I do not know. I am at work. Can you leave?" I could barely. I told my supervisor there was an emergency at home and drove 15 minutes over the speed limit back to Meadowbrook Estates. When I turned onto my street, everything looked fine. My property was uphill from the main subdivision, largely unaffected by whatever was happening below. But when I walked to the eastern side of my property and looked toward Pinewood Drive, I saw the disaster. Water was everywhere. The giant ice sheet had melted rapidly in the warm weather, releasing thousands of gallons all at once. The natural drainage swale that was supposed to channel water safely through the common area had been overwhelmed. Instead, the water had spread out across the frozen ground, unable to soak in, following the path of least resistance. That path led directly toward Pinewood Drive, which sat in a slight depression. 6 houses had water in their basements. The water had flowed downhill, found the foundation cracks and window wells, and poured in. I could see people outside, some with shop vacuums, others just standing and staring at their yards, which were now lakes. The water was still flowing, though slower now, as the last of the ice melted. I stood there trying to process what I was seeing. This was a catastrophic failure of drainage, exactly the kind of thing I was trained to prevent in my professional life. But I had been so focused on the day-to-day animal care that I had not properly considered where all that water was going. My phone rang. It was Brenda, and she was screaming before I even finished saying hello. "Do you see what you have done? Do you see this? My basement has 3 inches of water, my finished basement with custom carpeting. This is your fault." "Brenda, I am looking at it now. I did not intend you created a glacier on your property. All because you refused to comply with a simple rule. You are going to pay for every cent of damage. The rule that banned essential equipment for animal care. The rule we are fighting in court because it is illegal. We will see what is illegal when you are paying to replace my carpet and drywall. I have already called my insurance company and they are sending someone today. My attorney will be contacting you." She hung up. I stood there for another moment, then walked down through the common area to assess the damage properly. The drainage swale was obvious now. A channel about 4 feet wide that ran from my property line toward the houses. It should have been adequate for normal snowmelt and rain, but the concentrated release of water from the melting ice sheet had exceeded its capacity. The ground was frozen solid, preventing absorption, so all the water had stayed on the surface. Tom Bradley was outside his house on Pinewood Drive, watching a water mitigation company pump water from his window well. He saw me approaching and waved me over, looking exhausted rather than angry. "Quite a mess," he said. "I am so sorry, Tom. I did not anticipate this would happen. Brenda is furious. She is already talking lawsuits." "I know. She called me." Tom sighed and rubbed his face. "For what it is worth, I voted against that equipment ban. Seemed like overreach to me. But Margaret always sides with Brenda, so I was outvoted. This was news to me. You voted against it?" I raised concerns at the meeting, said it seemed unnecessary and could cause problems. Brenda shut me down pretty quick. I should have fought harder. He looked at the water still trickling past his foundation. "This is going to cost thousands to fix." I did not know what to say. He was right. Even if insurance covered most of it, there would be deductibles and rate increases. And it was my water that caused it, even if the circumstances were complicated. The rest of that day was a nightmare. I went home and looked at the melted remains of the ice sheet, trying to calculate how much water had been locked in that frozen mass. Thousands of gallons, easily. All of it generated from breaking ice 4 times a day for 2 months. All because I could not use the heated tanks that would have prevented ice formation in the first place. Sarah came home and we walked the property together. She was worried, I could tell, but trying to stay calm. What are we looking at here? Legally? Financially? I honestly do not know. We could argue the HOA caused this by banning the heated tanks. They could argue I should have managed the runoff better. Insurance might cover some of it, might not. Can we afford this if we are liable? That was the question that kept me up that night. We had savings, but not enough to cover tens of thousands in damage to 6 houses. If we were found fully liable, we could lose everything. The next morning, I called Patricia and explained the situation. There was a long silence after I finished. "This complicates things," she said finally. "The HOA will definitely argue that your non-compliance caused the damage. We need to be very careful about how we proceed, but they created the situation by banning the equipment. If I had been allowed to use the heated tanks, there would not have been any ice buildup or runoff. That is our argument, yes. But a court might see it as you having a responsibility to manage runoff regardless of the circumstances that created it. You are an engineer. They could argue you should have foreseen this risk. She was right, and I felt sick about it. I should have seen it. Any first-year engineering student could have calculated that breaking ice repeatedly in freezing conditions would create drainage problems. I had been so focused on fighting the HOA and caring for the animals that I had missed the obvious consequence of my actions. Over the next week, the situation escalated. All 6 affected homeowners filed insurance claims. 3 of them had significant damage beyond just wet basements. Brenda's finished basement was indeed destroyed, with soaked carpet, warped drywall, and damaged furniture. One couple, the Hendersons, had a basement bedroom that had been flooded with enough water to destroy the mattress and electronics. Margaret Chen's house had water damage in the utility room that affected her furnace. My insurance company sent an adjuster who walked the property, took measurements, and asked detailed questions about the ice buildup. He was professional but non-committal about coverage. We will need to review the circumstances thoroughly. The fact that you were aware of the ice formation and did not mitigate the runoff could be an issue. I was mitigating it the only way I could while complying with an HOA rule, I protested. Noted, we will take everything into consideration. The court hearing for our original complaint was still pending, but now there was a second legal front. Brenda filed a lawsuit on behalf of the HOA and the affected homeowners, seeking damages for the flooding. The total being claimed was $87,000. I nearly had a heart attack when I saw that number. Patricia filed a counterclaim arguing that the HOA's negligent ban on essential equipment had directly caused the flooding. We were asking for the ban to be overturned, for reimbursement of our legal fees, and for acknowledgement that the HOA was liable for any flooding damages. The legal process ground forward slowly. Meanwhile, I had reconnected the heated tanks, figuring there was no point in continuing the ice-breaking routine now that we were already in litigation over its consequences. Brenda sent another violation notice, which I ignored. She could add it to the pile. February brought more cold weather, but nothing like January. The animals were much happier with consistent water access. Emma spent more time with them, her mood improving now that they were not suffering. But the shadow of the lawsuit hung over everything. Sarah and I barely talked about anything else. We went over finances, discussed worst-case scenarios, and lay awake at night worrying about losing our house. The discovery phase of the lawsuit was excruciating. We had to provide documentation of everything related to the water tanks, the ice buildup, our property maintenance, and our finances. The HOA's attorneys deposed me for 6 hours, asking pointed questions about why I had not taken steps to manage the runoff, whether I had consulted with other engineers about the drainage, and whether I had intentionally created the flooding to make a point. That last question made me furious. You think I flooded 6 houses on purpose to prove a point about water heaters? That is insane. Robert Crane, the HOA attorney, just smiled. I am asking about your state of mind. You were angry at the HOA. You felt their rule was unjust. Some might argue you allowed the situation to develop as a form of protest. I allowed it to develop because I was exhausted from working full-time, breaking ice 4 times a day, and trying to keep my animals alive. I did not have the time or energy to engineer a drainage solution for a problem that should not have existed in the first place. But you are an engineer. You have expertise in drainage and water management. You knew better. He had me there, and we both knew it. Yes, I should have known better. Yes, I should have done something about the ice buildup. The fact that I had a good reason for being overwhelmed did not change the technical reality that I had allowed a dangerous situation to develop. Patricia did her best to counter this in my defense. She deposed Brenda, asking her detailed questions about the reasoning behind the equipment ban. Brenda struggled to articulate any legitimate safety or aesthetic concerns, eventually falling back on the board has discretion to make rules for the community's benefit. But you were aware that Mr. Garrison needed the heated tanks for his livestock. He has options. He chose the most convenient one and refused to consider alternatives. What alternatives did you suggest to him? That is not my responsibility. He is the one with animals. So you banned equipment you knew was essential, offered no alternative solutions, and expected him to figure it out on his own during a Montana winter. I expected him to follow the rules like everyone else. Patricia also got Brenda to admit she had never liked having livestock in the community and had received 0 complaints about the heated tanks from any other homeowner. It was purely her personal crusade, not a community concern. Tom Bradley's deposition was more helpful to our case. He testified that he had opposed the ban, thought it was excessive, and believed Brenda was pursuing a personal agenda. He also noted that the HOA had done nothing to maintain the drainage swale in the common area, which might have better handled the runoff if it had been properly cleared of vegetation and debris. By March, we were drowning in legal fees. Patricia estimated we had spent $15,000 already, with potentially that much more to go before trial. The stress was affecting everything. Sarah and I argued about money constantly. Emma's grades slipped because we were too distracted to help with homework. I lost weight because I was too anxious to eat properly. This had gone from a simple disagreement about water heaters to a lawsuit that might destroy us financially. The judge finally ruled on our original complaint in mid-March. He found that the HOA's equipment ban was overly broad and contradicted the covenant's agricultural use provisions. He ordered the ban overturned and required the HOA to allow heated livestock tanks and similar essential equipment. It was a victory, but a hollow one given the ongoing flooding lawsuit. Brenda was predictably furious about the ruling. She sent an email to the entire community claiming the judge had sided with a reckless homeowner who endangered the neighborhood. Several neighbors replied telling her to stop, that she had caused this problem herself. A petition started circulating to recall her as HOA president. I signed it, along with 47 other homeowners. But winning the equipment argument did not solve the flooding liability question. That case continued separately, now focused entirely on whether I should have managed the runoff better and whether the HOA bore any responsibility for creating the circumstances that led to the flooding. In April, something unexpected happened. The Montana Department of Environmental Quality contacted me. Someone had filed a complaint about the flooding, and they were investigating whether there had been any environmental violations. The agent who came to inspect was a woman named Julie Henderson, no relation to my flooded neighbors. She walked the property, examined the drainage patterns, and interviewed me about what had happened. "Who filed the complaint?" I asked. "I cannot disclose that, but given the circumstances, I imagine you can guess." Brenda, obviously, trying to create more legal pressure. Julie completed her inspection and reviewed the drainage in the common area. 2 weeks later, I received her report. It concluded that I had not violated any environmental regulations. However, it also noted that the HOA had failed to properly maintain the drainage swale in the common area, which was their responsibility under the subdivision's stormwater management plan. That neglected maintenance had contributed to the flooding by reducing the swale's capacity to handle water flow. This was huge. Patricia immediately filed an amended counterclaim, adding allegations of HOA negligence in maintaining common area drainage. We now had an official state environmental report supporting our argument that the HOA's failures had contributed to the flooding. The Hendersons, one of the couples with flooded basements, reached out to me privately in early May. We met at a coffee shop in Billings, both of us awkward and uncomfortable. "We wanted you to know we are dropping out of the lawsuit," Mark Henderson said. "We have been watching how this played out, and we do not think you are the only one at fault here. Brenda pushed that stupid rule. The HOA did not maintain the drainage, and you got caught in the middle trying to care for your animals." His wife Jennifer nodded. "Our insurance covered most of our damage. We just want this over with. The way Brenda has been acting, harassing you and sending those emails, it is not okay." I felt a wave of relief so strong I almost teared up. "Thank you, you have no idea how much this means." "We have kids too," Jennifer said. "We understand wanting to give them experiences with animals." This whole thing got out of hand. 2 other homeowners dropped out of the lawsuit over the next 3 weeks, also stating they believed the situation was more complicated than Brenda was claiming. That left just 3 plaintiffs: Brenda, Margaret, and an older man named Carl Foster who mostly seemed to be following Brenda's lead. The HOA recall election happened in June. Brenda lost by a landslide, receiving only 11 votes out of 83 cast. A new president was elected, a reasonable guy named Paul Martinez who worked as a teacher and had no interest in micromanaging everyone's lives. One of his first acts was to review the pending litigation. Paul called me in early July. "Henry, this is Paul Martinez, new HOA president. I have been reviewing the lawsuit situation and I want to discuss settlement options. This has gone on too long and cost too much." We met at a neutral location, a conference room at the local library. Paul brought the HOA's attorney, but his attitude was completely different from Brenda's scorched earth approach. "Here's what I am proposing," Paul said. "The HOA acknowledges that the equipment ban was overly broad and contributed to the circumstances that caused the flooding. You acknowledge that you could have done more to manage runoff. We agree to split responsibility and costs. The HOA's insurance will cover half the remaining damages, and your insurance covers the other half. Both sides drop all claims and we move forward." It was reasonable, more than reasonable given how hostile things had been. Patricia advised me to accept. "You will end up paying maybe $10,000 out of pocket after insurance. That is a lot better than the risk of going to trial and potentially being found fully liable." I agreed to the settlement. Brenda was apparently furious, but she was no longer in a position to block it. The HOA board voted to accept the terms, and we signed the agreement in August. But the story did not end there. In September, I received a call from the Yellowstone County Attorney's Office. They were investigating allegations of HOA misconduct and wanted to interview me. I was confused until the investigator explained. We have received complaints that the former HOA president, Brenda Patterson, may have misused HOA funds during her tenure. We are looking into her financial management and decision-making. Your case came up as an example of potentially inappropriate spending. I met with investigators and learned that Brenda had spent over $30,000 of HOA money on legal fees fighting me. Much of it after the board had voted to settle, but while she still had check-signing authority. She had also paid herself for various administrative expenses that were not properly documented. The new board had discovered these issues when they did a full audit after taking over. The investigations continued through the fall. In November, almost exactly 1 year after the equipment ban had been implemented, Brenda was charged with misappropriation of HOA funds and misconduct in office. It was not a massive criminal case, but it was enough to result in misdemeanor charges and significant financial penalties. She pled guilty in January to avoid trial and was sentenced to probation, community service, and full restitution of the misused funds. She also had to step down from any future HOA positions. I felt a grim satisfaction watching her stand in court accepting responsibility. Though mostly I just felt tired. The flooding damage was fully repaired by spring. The new HOA board approved a project to improve the drainage swale in the common area, properly grading and maintaining it to handle future runoff. They also revised the HOA covenants to include a clearer process for rule changes, requiring input from affected homeowners and consideration of practical impacts before implementation. My animals thrived through the following winter with the heated tanks operating normally. Emma, now 12, had taken on more responsibility for their care, and I was proud of how she handled it. The chickens laid eggs prolifically once they were no longer stressed by frozen water. The goats produced healthy kids that spring. Butterscotch remained absurdly spoiled and beloved. Sarah and I recovered slowly from the stress and financial strain. We had paid about $12,000 out of pocket after insurance, which was painful but manageable. More importantly, we had learned to address problems earlier rather than letting them escalate. We also learned which neighbors were allies and which would follow someone like Brenda without questioning her motives. Rick, my beekeeper neighbor, summed it up well when we talked over his fence one warm spring evening. The whole thing was stupid from the start. If Brenda had just left you alone, none of it would have happened. The flooding, the lawsuits, the money, all of it came from her needing to control something that was not her business. He was right. The heated tanks had operated safely for 2 winters before Brenda decided they were a problem. There had been no complaints, no safety issues, no legitimate concerns. She had manufactured a crisis to assert authority, and when I pushed back, she escalated rather than reconsidering. The flooding was a direct consequence of her unreasonable ban, combined with my exhaustion and the HOA's neglected maintenance responsibilities. I think about that a lot now, how a simple piece of livestock equipment became the center of a legal battle that consumed a year of my life and cost tens of thousands of dollars. How my daughter's drawing of sad farm animals symbolized not just cold pets but a family under attack for trying to live according to the rules we had agreed to when we bought our home. The new HOA board worked well. Paul Martinez was fair and reasonable, focused on actual community needs rather than personal crusades. When another homeowner wanted to install solar panels, the board worked with him to find a placement that met both his energy needs and aesthetic guidelines. When someone complained about a neighbor's lawn ornaments, the board reviewed the issue and found no violation rather than inventing new rules. I served on a committee to revise the covenant enforcement procedures, making sure future boards could not abuse their authority the way Brenda had. We implemented requirements for impact assessments before new rules, mandatory comment periods for homeowners, and clear appeals processes. It was not exciting work, but it mattered. Emma's 8th grade science project was about water drainage and erosion control. She built a model showing how proper drainage systems prevent flooding, using our property's situation as a case study. She got an A and presented it at the school science fair. Watching her explain drainage swales and frozen ground permeability to judges, I felt an odd sense of pride. She had learned from this disaster, taken something negative and turned it into knowledge. The legal bills were finally paid off by the end of that summer, 2 full years after the initial equipment ban. Sarah and I took Emma to Yellowstone National Park to celebrate being debt-free again. We hiked and saw wildlife and slept in a cabin with no livestock to water and no HOA breathing down our necks. It was the first time in years I felt truly relaxed. When we got back, there was a letter in our mailbox from Tom Bradley. He had decided to run for the HOA board and wanted my support. I called him immediately and told him he had it. Tom won his election easily. and became a voice of reason on the board, often asking, "But is this actually a problem that needs solving?" before implementing new rules. The Montana winter came again, as it always does. I plugged in the heated livestock tanks in October, and they ran all winter without incident. No ice to break, no exhausting midnight trips to the barn, no runoff causing problems. Just animals with consistent access to water, which was all I had wanted in the first place. Brenda moved out of Meadowbrook Estates in the spring. Someone told me she had relocated to Arizona, where presumably there were new HOAs for her to join and new rules for her to enforce. I did not wish her ill, but I did not wish her well either. Mostly, I just felt relieved she was gone. The goats had more kids. The chickens kept laying eggs. Butterscotch remained ridiculous and Emma's best friend. Sarah got a promotion at the hospital. I managed several successful projects at work, including a major drainage system for a new subdivision that I designed with perhaps excessive attention to handling runoff in extreme conditions. My boss joked that I seemed really focused on flood prevention, and I just smiled. Life returned to normal, or as normal as life gets when you are raising a family and managing a hobby farm in Montana. The heated livestock tanks hummed quietly in the barn, doing their simple job of keeping water liquid in freezing temperatures. Such a basic thing, really, such an obvious necessity. It seemed absurd that it had ever been controversial. Sometimes I walked out to the eastern fence line and looked at where the ice sheet had formed, where all that water had flowed downhill into people's homes. The drainage swell was obvious now that it had been properly maintained, a clear channel designed to manage water safely. If it had been maintained all along, if the heated tanks had never been banned, if Brenda had just minded her own business, none of the flooding would have occurred. But you cannot change the past. You can only learn from it and build something better going forward. The new HOA was better. Our neighborhood relationships were stronger, sorted into those who had supported reasonable solutions and those who had followed Brenda's crusade. Emma was growing up understanding that sometimes standing up for what is right comes with costs, but that you do it anyway. The final chapter came almost 3 years after the initial equipment ban, when I received an unexpected email from Margaret Chen. She had also left the HOA board after Brenda's recall, embarrassed by her role in the situation. Her email was simple. "Henry, I want to apologize. I should have thought for myself instead of just agreeing with Brenda. The equipment ban was wrong and I knew it at the time but did not have the courage to say so. I am sorry for the trouble it caused you and your family. I hope you can forgive me." I wrote back telling her I appreciated the apology and held no grudge. Life was too short to carry anger about things that were resolved. She had been a follower, not the instigator, and she had ultimately helped end the conflict by supporting the settlement. That felt like the true ending, when even the people who had sided against me acknowledged that the whole thing had been misguided. The heated livestock tanks were just tanks. The water was just water. The animals were just animals living their simple lives, needing simple care. Everything else had been human drama, unnecessary and destructive. I am still on that same 20 acres in Meadowbrook Estates. Emma is in high school now, talking about becoming a veterinarian. She still feeds the animals every morning before school, though now she drives herself there in the old truck I gave her. Sarah and I have settled into middle age comfortably, our biggest stress these days being normal things like college planning and home repairs. The heated livestock tanks are still plugged in every winter, still keeping the water at 40 degrees, still allowing the animals to drink whenever they want. No one complains, no one sends violation notices. The HOA focuses on actual community needs like road maintenance and snow removal. It is boring and functional, which is exactly what an HOA should be. I learned a lot from that whole experience about standing up for what is right, about understanding complex systems and their consequences, and about how quickly reasonable people can create unreasonable situations. I learned that being technically correct is not always enough, that you also need to manage the practical implications of your choices. I learned that exhaustion and frustration can blind you to obvious problems, but mostly I learned that some battles are worth fighting, even when they cost more than you anticipated. Those animals deserved proper care. The covenants we had agreed to deserved to be honored. Arbitrary rules pushed by petty people deserved to be challenged. The flooding was terrible and costly, but I do not regret fighting the equipment ban. I only regret not managing the consequences better. On cold winter mornings now, I walk out to the barn and see steam rising from the heated tanks, the goats already drinking, the chickens pecking around in their coop with liquid water available. Emma comes out with me sometimes, and we check on everyone together. Butterscotch knickers for attention and treats. The sun comes up over the Montana landscape, beautiful and harsh and unforgiving to those who are not prepared. We are prepared now. We have heated tanks and proper drainage and reasonable HOA leadership and hard-won knowledge about fighting for what matters. The water stays liquid. The animals stay healthy. Life goes on, simple and complicated all at once. in the way that life always is when you are paying attention and doing your best. That is the story of how the HOA banned my heated livestock tanks and then complained when frozen runoff flooded their homes. It was messy and expensive and stressful and entirely avoidable. But we survived it, learned from it, and built something better on the other side. And every winter morning when those tanks keep the water from freezing, I remember why it mattered enough to fight.